Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to all the people who are watching us today on this very relevant topic on abundance, on the experience of living in a world of information plenty. Today, we have a great honor here at the Global Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution at the University of São Paulo to have two special guest speakers. And I am very glad that we're approaching our topics to information of abundance. As you know, those of you who follow us at the Global Institute for Peace on our channels, you see that we deal with very many different issues of peace and conflict resolution, involving gender, involving health. And today we have as I see it, a mixture of different topics. We're talking about abundance, and we're talking about being bombarded with information from the outside world too. So first and foremost, I would like to say thank you very much to Pablo Bukowski. Pablo is someone with a interdisciplinary background that stems both from science and technology and sociology. He got his PhD from Cornell, and then his first appointment as a professor was the MIT, and today he's a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. He is the author of the book that we're dealing today, published by Oxford University Press, whom we would like to thank as well for the institutional support. And the title of the book is the exact title of our live today. And the suggestion stemmed from Professor Heloísa Pait, who is a professor of sociology at Unesp in São Paulo. And Heloísa is so well equipped to handle this issue today because she also comes from this interdisciplinary background, someone who has a different perspective on academic and scientific issues, including at the University of São Paulo, she studied economics and then moving on to her PhD at the New School in New York City, all the way to becoming a professor of sociology today, a well-published author as well. And with no further ado, I'd like to bring the word on to Heloísa so that she can lead this very exciting panel we're having today. Thank you both.
Thank you very much, Gerson. Thank you, everybody at GLIP, and thank you, Pablo, for coming to São Paulo to talk about your new book with us. It's a very pressing topic. Like, how do we deal with the abundance of information in a personal way, but also in a public, in a political way? That's been our concern. And we are very happy to have you here to make a presentation of your book. I'm also very interested in your talk because my research questions, they are related to this. I'm also looking at global media from the perspective of this, middle income countries that have very different histories, different paths to reach this abundance of information. The abundance could be quite similar if we look in the first slide, but when we look at our histories and our media cultures, they might be not only different, but this difference can bring new perspectives. So my main interest in your talk is, what do we learn from looking at global media from the perspective of a Latin American country? With this general question, eu te dou a palavra.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gerson, for inviting me here. Thank you, Heloísa, for a great introduction and for agreeing to be part in this panel. Thank you to our colleagues at USP and at GLIP. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start sharing a screen for my presentation. Let me know if, no, this is not the screen that I want to share. Give me 1 second. Let me do this. Give me 1 second that I will select the screen that I want to share. There you go. Let's see if this works now. Perfect. Okay, so please let me know if you have any problems seeing this. Otherwise, I'm going to assume it's okay.
We see it perfectly.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So the book that Gerson alluded to is Abundance, was published by Oxford University Press a few months ago, and it addresses the issue of what is the experience of living in a world with a lot of information. Now, we are not the first society in history that has confronted a sudden, massive leap in the amount of information available. The two quotes here from Seneca and Pliny the Elder illustrates that these concerns also took place in antiquity. And in some ways, they illustrate the two main trends with which nowadays we tend to address this issue. We have the dystopic view of Seneca here, and also the social dilemma as per Netflix. And we also have a more measured and contextualized view, which is the view of Pliny the Elder, for whom there was no book so bad as not to have something of use in some part of it. Now, this volume of information that Seneca, Pliny, and their contemporaries confronted have nothing to do with the volume of information that we confront today. You know, this is the most recent calculation that is done every year about, you know, how much new information is created and how much, how many, dollars are spent on digital related stuff every minute of the day today, which is a staggering amount, something that is almost a word of science fiction for those of us who grew up in a different century. So because this is an issue that has recurred in history, happened in antiquity, happened in the early modern period, it happened, of course, in the Renaissance and the invention related to the invention of the printing press, among other technological innovations. It happened in Enlightenment, and it happened also at the dawn of the 20th century. It is not surprising that the social and behavioral sciences have devoted considerable effort to try to understand what is the experience of, living in a society that goes through a sudden leap and a massive increase in the information available. The main concept that has been developed to address this issue is this idea of information overload, and that is illustrated in this chart that I present in this slide that recurs the chart in different papers, in different books on the topic. And the idea is that there is a sweet spot of information that is the perfect amount to make the best decision. And after that sweet spot, any added amount of information actually has negative, detrimental effects. So if this is the main notion that we have used to address this issue of living in a world with a lot of information, why is it that in the book I don't call it information overload, I call it abundance? And I do this switch from overload to abundance because I believe the notion of information overload presents a number of limitations to try to understand our experience, our contemporary experience with the world of media, information, and communication. First of all, most of the research on information overload has focused on what I call instrumental uses of information that is used to make particular decisions. But we know, however, that in our daily life, we use information for multiple purposes, not only to make decisions, but also to entertain ourselves, to connect with others, to kill time, to express ourselves on social media, to manage everyday life. Second, because of the instrumental uses of information, most of the focus analytically has been at the cognitive level, and in particular having to do with decision-making in work environments, where you can assume a level of optimality, right? We know in the workplace there are better and worse decisions, and sometimes we can really know what is the best decision and the best use of time. However, if we are dealing with multiple uses of information, not just making a decision, but watching a movie or posting on social media, or managing 700 new messages on WhatsApp groups that we'll all have after we reconnect to our with our mobile devices after this talk. There are issues not only of information bits, but also interpretation, what this information means to us. There are also issues of emotion or affect. I mean, different kinds of information makes us feel certain things, and those are things that escape the cognitive dimension. And there are issues of practices and routines that we have enacted and developed over a long period of time that are very difficult to change sometimes. And all of these issues of affect, interpretation, and practice relate to the fact that we use this information not only in multiple ways, but also in multiple settings. And therefore, it is very difficult to assume that there is an optimum amount of information for every given task. Is it optimum that I will doom scroll on Facebook for an hour before going to bed instead of reading a novel or catching up a little bit with work? Well, it really depends, right? So, and that's why the default discourse of deficit that has been associated with this idea of information overload, that is more information, worse for people, has to be replaced by what I call this notion of emergent valuation, that whether something is good or bad for the person or the group or the society at hand has to do with a number of factors that are contextual, the purposes for which information is used, the trade-offs, etc., etc. And finally, most of the work on information overload has been undertaken from the perspective of the analyst, the ethic perspective, and pursued with the use of quantitative methods, mostly experiments or surveys. But if we really want to understand issues of what things mean to people, how those meanings relate to different configurations of practice and the emotional states associated with them, we need to add to these quantitative methods qualitative methods like ethnography that get at problems from the perspective of the actors, the emic perspective, not only the perspective of the analyst. So in the book, I try to answer this main question of what is the experience of living in a world of information plenty by subdividing it into three main, secondary but key questions. The first one is the macro level sociological perspectives. That is, how do variations in structural factors such as age, gender, and socioeconomic status, together with level of educational attainment, really affect the conditions of access to the technologies that we use to get at this information and to the different content options that are carried to these technologies. Within this broad sort of macro structural picture, then the second question gets at the meso to micro level of analysis, trying to understand how do variations in cultural dynamics, such as routines, that are enacted and the meanings that are attributed to both technologies and content, affect that experience in everyday life. And the third question is a so what question, what Eloisa was alluded to at the beginning. What does this mean for current trends in media, in society, and in politics? To answer these questions, in the book, I developed a four-pronged approach. The first one is that I draw from Jim Carrey's idea that communication is about making meaning together and enacting practices of being in society. And I draw from this way of understanding communication rather than the more transmission view of communication that essentially focuses purely on information processing. Because as I alluded to before, it is impossible to understand today's world of information abundance without understanding that it has a technological dimension and it has a content dimension. And that when we talk about content, there are different kinds of content: social media content, current affairs content, entertainment, etc. In the book, I draw from the different subfields of inquiry within the social and behavioral sciences, and to some extent the humanities, that have looked at these issues of content and technology, of news and entertainment, and bring them together into a single conceptual framework. Then I try to integrate issues of concerns with structural configurations and cultural dynamics. The focus is mostly on culture, but understanding that that is not divided from social structure. And then again, my focus is mostly on what's going on contemporaneously. However, I remain quite anchored in the historical literature that has looked at different responses in different historical periods to significant information growth, hence the quotes with which I started today's presentation, to try to understand what might be new about the current environment and what might be just a reenactment of societal responses that were already developed in different historical periods, most notably the early modern period, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. And the fourth conceptual anchor or pillar of this approach is that I not only conducted the inquiry in the Global South, but I was, as Eloisa mentioned, quite aware about the location of the inquiry to, really understand what are the scope conditions of the argument. And this contrasts with a lot of the literature. I would say more than 90% of the literature on information overload is literature that not only has been developed in the global north and about empirical settings in the global north, but has adopted what is known as the view from nowhere. It has assumed that what applies to the global north applies anywhere in the world, whereas I want to try to understand, as Eloisa alluded to, issues of cultural specificity and also what might travel across national settings. The research for this book is primarily drawing on almost 160 semi-structured interviews that were conducted in the city of Buenos Aires and a number of the provinces, the city, the suburbs of Buenos Aires, and a number of provinces in Argentina between March 16 and December 17. And I also draw secondarily, but not less importantly, on an in-person survey conducted in the city and suburbs of Buenos Aires in October 2016, about a third into the fieldwork, and informed by trends that emerged in the first third of the fieldwork. Now, why Argentina, in addition to the fact that I am Argentine myself, and there are always happy moments when I get to return to my country to do research there. So I argue in the book that there are three key features that make Argentina a particularly fertile environment to try to answer the questions posed in this book. The first one is that relative to the countries of the global north, which tend to be high-income countries, a low middle-income country such as Argentina, which has much greater, material scarcity than countries in the global north, reveal more about the motivations that people might have for connecting to a world of information plenty. That is, the technological means that are required are not as easy to obtain in a low middle income country like Argentina as they are in a high income country like the US, Germany, Norway, etc. The second is that there's been a lot of talk about this environment of information plenty leading people to become more alone. That's the word that Sherry Turkle uses in her work, together alone or alone together. And several statements of that kind. Now, those statements are made about processes happening in societies that have much more individualistic and instrumentalistic social cultures or cultures of sociability. Argentina has a much more stronger associational culture that long predates this. I mean, it goes back hundreds of years. And so it provides an interesting alternative environment to see whether the effects of information abundance actually necessarily lead for us to become more alone, or in different environments, they lead to different cultures of association. And the third feature that makes Argentina particularly suitable has to do with the fact that another key topic of discussion among scholars and analysts about this environment of information abundance is that it tends to be associated with significant levels of distrust about media and institutions in general, the idea that social media is contributing to destroy democratic polities, etc., etc. Now, these claims have often been made in the context of societies that have much higher levels of trust in institutions than most of the countries in the global south. Argentina, for instance, in the studies that our colleagues at the University of Oxford put together every year on with the digital news report, Argentina is usually in the bottom quartile in terms of levels of trust towards news and journalism. And since the global trend is in general towards a deterioration in terms of trust in institutions, what I argue in the book is that Argentina actually provides what unfortunately might be an interesting avant-garde of what many other countries in the world might experience. The book is organized into 6 chapters, an intro, an outro, and then 4 empirical chapters. What I want to do today is to delve for about 10 or 15 minutes into chapter 4, chapter having to do with news, to give you a little bit more of a flavor of the findings and the implications of the analysis. So if we think about the sociological literature on news consumption during the second half of the 20th century, there are 3 main findings that are central to understanding how news consumption took place with regards to traditional media, but also set the stage for the analysis of what might be going on today in a world of information abundance. The first one was that the consumption of news tended to be significantly routinized. Most people did, look at the same television channels, the same time of the day, read the same newspapers, etc., etc. That high level of routinization was connected to fairly predictable temporal and spatial patterns. Newspapers were usually read in the morning and at home. Television news was watched in the evening in the living room. There was some reading of print newspapers to and from work, and some listening to the radio to and from work if one drove a car. And in work environments where people work by themselves or in very small groups, they might have the radio on. So it was a picture that was quite organized, right? And it was also organized by being integrated into relational patterns. Whether a particular newscast was watched at home or whether a particular newspaper was bought had to do with broader household and familial dynamics, and the same in the workplace. Now, cutting across these 3 main findings, there are 2 underlying assumptions that were usually unstated in the literature, but they're particularly important for the argument today. Number 1, that information was something that had to be obtained. Somebody had to go and buy a newspaper, or subscribe monthly to a newspaper. Somebody had to go and turn on the television set to watch TV. Same, we turn on the radio set to listen to the news. And the second assumption is that once people obtain the news, the routines, the practices that they enacted to consume the news were primary. By primary, I mean that they were the primary focus of somebody's attention. When somebody read the newspaper, they read the newspaper. When they watched the TV news, Walter Cronkite being like the quintessential sort of figure for that in the evening in the United States, they primarily did that. Now, with this picture in mind, let's examine consumption of news in a world of information abundance. So it turns out that Argentines are very, very well informed. 97% of the survey respondents said they got their news daily. And contrary to the idea that the world of digital is taking over, and everything else is moving to the background in the case of news, what we see is that most people inform themselves through broadcast media, primarily television, secondarily radio, and that digital media, combination of social media and news sites, are the main alternative to broadcast. So what is being pushed to the side is the world of print, but the world of broadcast news is alive and well, not growing. Probably what is growing is digital, so this picture might change in 10 years, but as of now, we're still in a country like Argentina. There is still a huge difference between the penetration of broadcast and the penetration of digital for news consumption. And not only Argentines are very well informed, mostly through broadcast and digital media, they also exhibit highly routinized ways of doing that. 3/4 of the survey respondents agree with the sentence, I always consume the same media. But what kind of routines do they enact to that? That is, how do people deal with an information environment in which there is news everywhere? Every time there is a breaking news story, it circulates on social media and on digital in a matter of seconds, and then it gets reproduced by broadcast. And the content that we see in the different outlets, it is mostly the same. That is, it's largely commoditized. So how is it that people deal with a lot of information on the one side and then their own personal experience? So I argue in the book that there are 5 cultural dynamics that mediate between the abundance of information in the environment and the individual reception experiences. The first cultural dynamic has to do with the fact that the routines that people enact to deal with this, to consume the news, are not primary anymore. They are what I call derivative. They are routines that are primarily about something else. Sandra, who's a psychotherapist, said that she got the news for the last time before the interview while she was doing household chores, listening to the radio. Norberto said the same. In his case, he was not doing household chores, he was cooking, mowing the lawn, etc. But he says, I do not sit down to listen to the radio. That is, that's not a primary routine. This applies not only to broadcast media, but also to social media, digital media. Juana said that in her case, the last time that she got the news before the interview is when she was walking to the cafeteria of her university. She was looking at her phone, was looking at Twitter while entering the cafeteria. She wasn't walking to get the news, she was walking to get a coffee. And since he was there, she checked Twitter. And the same for Luciana and Facebook, right? She was on Facebook for something else. There was a headline that grabbed her attention. She went and read it. These derivative routines are associated with the fact that for most people, they feel that they do not need to obtain information. Unlike the picture of the second half of the 20th century, what we have here is that people perceive that information is everywhere, is ambient, right? And they therefore enact a series of practices to take advantage of that. Julian, who's a film producer, says, with Facebook and Twitter, there is like a spillover theory of the news in which you eventually find out what's going on in the world. Right? Estefania, a clerical employee, says the same. Everything is so immediate today that, for instance, many news, I don't even have to go to lanacion.com, the site of La Nación, Argentina's quality newspaper, because on Twitter, when something happens on the other side of the world, you do a refresh on your Twitter page and you find out immediately because somebody retweeted from someone else who was on the scene. This applies not only to digital media, it also applies to broadcast media, in particular television. Sandra, has a habit, which is that, she doesn't almost watch TV, but it's always on and in the news. Same for Lucas, who says that, this is more like a waste of energy, which is a lifelong habit, than something that he pays attention to. So again, derivative routines, ambient information, and when they encounter this information, for most Argentines, they think that information is biased, but not biased as an exception, biased as the norm, right? So therefore, they develop a series of strategies to deal with systemic bias. In the survey, we asked the people to rate their level of agreement to the following, with the following statement. The news media of my country report the news independently of political powers. 2.5 more times, people disagreed than agreed with this. We asked a similar question replacing the word political with the word economic, and we got essentially the same results, or highly similar results, which is why it's not surprising that Carla says one cannot forget the idea that news has an intention, a connotation of either political partisanship or business reasons. And therefore, it is also not surprising that Carlos says none of the Argentine newspapers seem to me objective enough to trust in the news. I had such a large sample of interviewees that by coincidence, I had over a dozen people who had encountered events that were subsequently reported in the news. And not a single one of them was satisfied with the way the events were reported. To all of them, there were significant distortions. And their conclusion is that, you know, if these things happen in my town, as Carla says, I imagine that at a greater scale, it's all super manipulated. So what are the strategies that, you know, people have developed to deal with systemic bias? And the point here is not that the news is biased, it is systemically biased. So when a story is of particular interest to people, they essentially listen to multiple sites. And that has been replicated in a number of studies conducted in India, in different countries of Africa, and in Western Europe, and also in the US. The second main strategy is what I call focusing on the non-other. Since people think that the news is biased, right, by default, they prefer to go and consume news in news sites or television channels or radio stations or newspapers that are very open about their bias, about their particular stance, rather than on alternative competitors that pretend to be objective. And what they do is they prefer to go, say, if you are a progressive, they prefer to go into a conservative news site because they know what they mean, and they discount what they think is the additional ideology added to that, right? So for instance, Lucas says, my default newspaper is La Nación, and it opines totally different from what I think, but I know from which stance it writes, and I know where to position myself to be able to analyze the news story. The fourth cultural mechanism is that to people, they not only perceive the news to be systemically biased, but they also experience predominantly negative emotional states when they consume the news. So Sophia says, today I read on Facebook a story that somebody had found a newborn within a garbage bag. Why? What is the need to publish that story? They're all bad news. There isn't a single good one. It's pure angst, right? Agustina says the same. I get very sad when I watch the news. It's all bad. And what happens to many people is what happens to Marta, right? Marta says, you know, there is so much news that makes you feel badly that I prefer not to see the news. And the final cultural mechanism is that there is, I found very little evidence of attachment to the news. There is a lot of attachment to these devices, right? To mobile devices in particular. I mean, it's very difficult for people to detach from them. There is tremendous level of attachment to social media platforms. You know, we constantly go and see what's new. When there is, even for messaging services, when there is a new message on WhatsApp, we go and look at it. There is tremendous level of attachment to serialized fiction, to binge watching on streaming platforms. I found almost no evidence of attachment to the world of news. So as a result, we have news that is everywhere, but in terms of the value that it has in the experience of the consumer, it has been significantly devalued, much like the Argentine currency, unfortunately. The question is why? Right? So what I do in the book and this is why it really pays off to have looked at issues of news and also issues of entertainment, is that I contrast these findings with the findings in the following chapter, and I do not have time to present, but they're the findings on the consumption of a lot of entertainment information available. And I play with Adam Smith's the title of his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, to argue that we are in a situation of information abundance in which we have the juxtaposition of the poverty of facts and the wealth of fictions. And why has this wealth of fiction environment emerged? Where do we see it? We see it in the fact that, unlike the case of news, the routines continue to be primary, even when people do second screening, that is, they are WhatsApping somebody while watching a TV show, they are still focused primarily on the TV show, right? They also perceive that there is a lot of information available and that the information is ambient. They have to do very little to get entertainment information, right? The affect, however, associated with the consumption of entertainment is highly positive, right? Unlike the negative affect for the consumption of news. Even the people who like to watch horror films and very scary stuff that makes them cringe and sometimes gives them nightmares, when they talk about that, however, they talk about with significant level of positive affect. Because entertainment doesn't pretend to portray reality as is, there is no presence of distrust. And as I had alluded to before, there is significant level of attachment, in particular to serialized fiction on streaming platforms. So, putting the two together and thinking about the analysis of the 5 cultural mechanisms, what I propose in the book is that to account for this experiential devaluation of news, we first have to rule out a series of explanations. First of all, the economic explanation, that somehow this is an inevitable consequence of the increasing volume. Lots more volume, each unit is worth much less. However, if that was the case, why didn't it apply to entertainment, which has been strongly revalued experientially by people? The second is the technological explanation, that somehow perhaps this might be an artifact of worse technological capabilities. However, the technological capabilities that we have to tell the news today are unparalleled. We can do data journalism, we can do multimedia, we can do immersive environments, etc. Maybe it has to do with the media explanation, right? It has to do with the decrease in the level of content, but that is not true. At the high end, we probably have some of the best content in history. The international collaborative efforts of which we've seen the most recent results with the analysis of massive leaks of offshore companies done by Washington Post, Le Monde, El País, La Nación, a number of news sites, or the multimedia coverage, the data journalism coverage for elections, for instance, etc., has never been better. So what I argue in the book, if it's not technology, content, or the economy, what is it? And what I argue is that it has to do with cultural dynamics that are not necessarily primarily media focused. That is, what's at stake here is the fact that this information abundance has to be understood within the context of broader routines and meanings that envelop media and information consumption, and that have transformed the character of everyday life and in part the character of the polity in ways that are not really media-centric, right? They have to do with the ways in which we fold these news consumption patterns within much broader associational norms and practices and expectations about the polity and about culture in general. So what then? So in terms of the heuristics that we use to understand the media, what I argue in the book is that, building on the work of David Morley, Sarah Pink, Nick Couldry, Sean Moores, etc., I think we need to begin decentering the media in terms of how we explain communication phenomena. A lot of the focus of communication scholarship has been on communication factors, right? As communication centric. The same when the media talks about, communication, but by and large, people are not as interested in communication and information in media as there are communication scholars or communication professionals. And for them, what they do with information has much more to do with how they fold it in a derivative fashion into the fabric of everyday life than what both scholars and analysts tend to think. Second, I believe the account in this book, of which I offer just a tiny glimpse, shows the power of bridging between subfields of inquiry, in this case, for instance, studies of news and popular culture, that really can help counter the intellectual fragmentation that my colleague and compatriot Silvio Weisberg has so eloquently argued that it characterizes the study of media and communication in contemporary times. Theoretically, this account sort of helps us or invites us to rethink key concepts and ideas that have been premised on the assumption that people experientially value the news. But the power of the media to set the agenda, the power of journalism to play a significant role in democracy would be much less if we really focus on what people experientially value as opposed to what they, from a normative standpoint, they might want to value. And finally, what I argue is that this account helps us to put in perspective and contend with the crisis in both the appeal and the authority of the experts and institutions of modernity, of which journalism and the media are just one. And one final slide to illustrate what I mean by this. A few weeks ago, my compatriot Lionel Messi scored his first goal with Paris Saint-Germain. He posted 5 pictures of that in his own Instagram account, and within 24 hours, less than 24 hours, he had more than 40 million likes. These are not exposures. This is not that people saw this. People pay a little bit of attention, enough for them to decide whether they're going to like or not. At the same, so within that time frame, I looked at the most recent posts of the New York Times, and the New York Times needed, right, around 250 posts on Instagram, right, to get the same level of engagement that Messi had reached with one post about one goal that has symbolic significance, but nothing else. So do we really think that the institutions of modernity like journalism and the press set the agenda in society anymore when one footballer can get the same level of engagement that the New York Times does with 250 or 250 posts with just a single one of them? Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I have so many questions. I mean, it really made me think, the book and your presentation, and I really want to thank you. I'm going to start going back to the 2 epigraphs of the beginning of your presentation. In the 90s, at the New School, there was a debate like Adorno was right or Certeau was right. And of course, I was a Certeau person. I believed in reception, in the capacity of interpretation. And I and my colleagues, we felt that Adorno was elitist. He had this idea of reasoning and interpretation as something that only very privileged people could have, that something that demanded time, that demanded culture, and that most of us didn't have. But then when I look at the situation, and I think that's an idea that you might agree with me. But then when I look at the situation now, I begin to doubt my Eloisa's in the 90s, because I believe there should be at least some time before you like something. And we are not allowing ourselves this time to like or not like. We're just liking and sharing before we think. So I'm wondering if Adorno didn't have a point when he said that our our mind, our consciousness, is not anymore a place, is not anymore like the solid rock that the Enlightenment felt it was, because we're subordinated to this quantitative reasonings of, you know, more time, more money, and more things in more time, in less time. I mean, the speed, money, and the quantitativeness of our lives. I totally understand your argument. I'm just asking, wasn't Adorno or Seneca, as you quoted, didn't they have a point? I mean, and you talk about experience and meaning, but I feel sometimes that I didn't think. If you interview me, I'm gonna say, I have to repress myself. I have to control myself because I have to allow myself to think before I like, I share, I make comments. So how do you address these issues that are old issues in our field?
No, that's a fabulous question, Eloisa. Thank you for bringing that up. Perhaps it is not an either-or situation. So what is at stake really is the project of modernity. And by this I mean that what we consider thinking and what we consider pondering, deliberating, information processing is not immutable, because that is a cultural construction. And the word that Adorno was referring to, and the ideal conditions and idealized conditions that he was referring to, were cultural constructions. And perhaps they were also cultural constructions that only an elite group in society could enact on a regular basis, right? So I have seen no data in my studies to suggest that the audience is less active than before in the reception of information. But what being active means might be changing, right? And that has very little to do with information necessarily, or technologies as a cause, as an independent variable, if you wish. It's more, technology becomes more of an instrument in this case, and what we are seeing are transformations in the fabric of the polity, and transformations having to do with the nature of how capitalism is enacted, which is very different from 18th century Britain, right? So I think if you looked at the historical record, contemporaries, in particular elite contemporaries, have almost always decried these sudden changes in the amount of information available and in the means of technological reproduction. It wasn't just Seneca, it was Erasmus, right, etc., etc. Now, if you also look at the historical record, there have been many important developments that we still use today that emerge from confronting this problem of having too much information. Classification systems in the early modern period into the Renaissance. The idea of scientific disciplines in the Enlightenment, right, that led to a number of scientific discoveries and technological discoveries that have extended our life expectancy and had led to many other positive outcomes. So I think that there are lots of concerns that are being raised today, contemporaneously. I think they're important concerns. It is important to put them into perspective in two ways. Number one, historically, similar concerns were raised before. What does the historical record say? Perhaps more complicated, number one. Number two, the way the concerns are addressed today are ways that reify people. They turn human beings from subjects into objects that technology, Facebook, whatever does to us, right? That is a highly disempowering stance. And therefore, if social science is performative, a la Michelle Calon, Don Mackenzie, Karin Orsetina, etc., what this academic and journalistic discourse is doing is that it is actually disempowering people. So this is not to say that, that these technologies and usually the very large corporations that produce and capitalize on them do not have levels of power that are unheard of for most, of the history of capitalism. But one can have, a critical view of that without turning people into objects, right? But yes, the conditions of thinking have changed. Is that better or worse? I don't know. I leave that up to you, number one. Number two, the focus of attention has also changed. We can, I can elaborate on that, if you want more, but that would be my initial sort of response to your excellent question.
No, thank you very much. I'm gonna think about it. The conditions of thinking. I think that's a very good angle from which to see things. I have another question. You're looking from the point of view of Argentina. How do you? I don't know if you thought about Brazil. The difference. One of the main differences in Brazil is the issue of literacy, which is a very recent phenomenon in Brazil. To give you an idea, in 1950, our literacy rate was 50%. This is brutal. I'm talking about the middle of the 20th century, very technological century, and half of the population was illiterate. And how does it? How do you think these imbalances? Of course, when I say imbalances, I'm already presupposing a certain right path of development. But imbalances in relation to the first world, how do you think this can affect the way we deal with the abundance or overload of information? Does it? Because that's a question I have actually.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Yes, no, I think that's excellent, and it shows that when we say global north or global south, these are categories that have limited usefulness, in the sense that there are lots of differences, not only within global north. I mean, Norway is very different from the US, but within the global south, even within the same region, right? Rates of, as you say, literacy vary a lot in South America and vary within country, right? Urban environments versus rural environments, regions, etc. So, there are two things there. One is, in addition to issues of literacy per se, there are significant issues having to do with information technology literacy, right? So when people talk, for instance, about misinformation, a typical way in which solutions are suggested is by developing literacy campaigns, media literacy campaign, information literacy campaign. What the research for this book and other projects that have been concurrent and subsequent to it have shown is that people have significant levels of information technology and media literacy and information abundance literacy that are developed bottom up, right? But are nonetheless equally consequential. As if you learn something in school versus you learn it on the streets, but once you learn it, that becomes your way of dealing and dealing successfully relative to your own circumstances with it, that becomes deeply ingrained. So one of the differences between sort of high-income countries and middle and low-income countries is the way in which these information technology literacies are channeled either top down versus bottom up, right? And this is something that has been long predates our conversation. There is a terrific comparative cross-cultural psychologist who did studies of mathematical literacy in Mexico, applying Piaget framework, right? Showing that, kids who lived in the streets in Mexico could not perform arithmetic, right, calculations on paper, but because their livelihood depending on counting coins very rapidly, right? So they could perform calculations at a very high level, right, that were materially based. And one could go back to Vygotsky, right, 100 years ago, talking about, right, the development of cognitive systems.
There is a famous research here in Brazil that is called Zero na escola e 10 na vida, something like this, talking about kids, exactly the same phenomenon. Zero in school and 10 in life. Like
right.
these kids knew
right.
how to do math.
Right. And it's interesting because there is a question here from Roberta in the chat, right, that has to do with age. She asks, how do you handle age group in your studies? For instance, a 10-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 60-year-old, are they equally overburdened, etc.? So going back to this issue of literacy, what might be going on is the younger people, if you talk about the lower strata of society, those who are economically disadvantaged, who would be the same as those with lower levels of literacy in Brazil. Right? It's the younger members of the household who transmit technological literacy to the older members of the household, which is something that, for instance, our colleague Teresa Correa in Chile demonstrated in her studies of poor neighborhoods in the outskirts of Santiago. So they are not equally overburdened, they are differently overburdened, and they're not, I wouldn't say that necessarily they are overburdened, they deal with this differently. So for instance, I found significant level of attachment to the smartphone, right? But the reasons why people are attached are different. So younger people, their social lives, right, revolve around them, okay? Older people, they say they cannot part ways, especially those who live alone, those who have either divorced or widow and they don't have any more children in the household, they cannot part ways with the telephone either, but not because of the social side, because it is a way for them to feel safe in case they have a health emergency. So in both cases, they are equally connected to the abundance of information, but for different reasons, and they draw, right, different benefits from that. So age is a critical factor in my study, and it's a critical factor because it appears that age is a much more, belonging to a particular cohort, is a much stronger organizer of technological access and patterns of use than socioeconomic status, level of educational attainment, and gender, right? And what that does to society, I argue, is that it imbues society, it makes society be much more dynamic. A society that is organized around social class is very static because people do not change social class a lot during their lifetime. But we all age all the time, and we enter into different phases of life because of that. And that means that our society has a greater level of dynamism and sometimes a vertigo and an uncertainty associated with that is quite unique to the contemporary moment relative to other moments. So there are lots more questions I see in the chat, but we only have a couple more minutes to go. So let me know how you want to handle this.
I think that 1 hour is certainly not enough to discuss this topic. So how do I want to handle this? I want to get both of you back. But for this first session, I would suggest that maybe each of you has a closing argument or a concluding idea.
Perfect. Eloisa, would you like to go first?
I think I think we touched on many crucial issues for our region. And I just want to thank you, and I hope we'll be in touch, because I think we have similar angles from which we are looking at the issues, similar questions. So I just want to thank Gerson and the GLIPI team, and I want to thank Pablo. And I wish we had more time for the questions, but we'll try to do something in another occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eloisa. Thank you, Gerson, GLIPI. Thank you, Eloisa. I would say, practically speaking, I am more than happy to get the questions on email to my Northwestern email and then sort of answer them. I'd be delighted to have another session. And one thing that we perhaps could do is to convene a bit larger gathering of scholars working in different parts of Latin America and continue the conversation with a comparative angle, because I think it is important to discuss similarities across our countries and also differences, because it's at the intersection of what's similar and what's different that we can start sort of theorizing and having a better handle at things. So thank you very much to the audience also for the time and the questions.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Thank you very much, Eloisa. One thing that we could consider is to have a on-site seminar about this, where people may even be able to have workshops and discuss. And the idea that Pablo had from approaching it from different angles, I think it's very important. And when we talk about information, one thing that I did not feel today was overburdened. Exactly the opposite. I felt enlightened. So thank you so very much. And also, muito obrigado, Fábio Henrique, Giovanna Lordello, Lucas, for all your support. And we'll keep a track of questions and then send them over to you. Maybe you could continue this interaction online later, or at the University of São Paulo, where you're always very welcome.
Thank you very much. It will be a pleasure.